He did not stop because he was brave. He stopped because the silence felt wrong. Snow had been falling 3 hours, thick enough to erase the road lines. His truck idled on the shoulder, heat barely holding. Ahead, a car sat tilted in the ditch, engine dead, no hazard lights. He thought about Benji at home, about how easy it would be to keep driving. He pulled his gloves on anyway. By the time he reached her, the woman was barely conscious, coat soaked through. He did not know her name. He only knew the cold did not negotiate. Owen Calloway was 38 years old, and he had spent most of the last 3 years learning how to function without someone telling him he was doing it right. He was a licensed electrician who worked for himself, took whatever jobs came through, and drove a pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it and a heater that worked about 70% of the time. On the night of the storm, the heater was cooperating. He was grateful for that. He had found her slumped against the driver's door, the window fogged from her breath. The car had no heat left inside. She must have been sitting there for at least an hour in temperatures that his dashboard read as 11 degrees. He pulled her out carefully, talking to her the whole time. She responded with the small, cooperative movements of someone still present enough to understand that being moved was better than staying still. He had her in the passenger seat and the truck moving before he allowed himself to think about what he was doing. Her coat, a city coat, made for appearance rather than cold, was soaked dark along the shoulders. Her hands were pale in a way that worried him. He turned the vent toward her and kept driving. His house was a small craftsman on Delwood Lane, 3 miles off the state highway. He carried her inside, settled her on the sofa, and went to find the extra blanket from the hall closet. He covered her. He put water on for tea because he did not know what else to do. He sat at the kitchen table under the yellow overhead light and waited, his hands around a mug he never drank from. He was still sitting there at 2 in the morning when he heard the stairs creak, the second stair, which had a different sound from the third and meant Benji. His son appeared in the kitchen doorway in fox-printed pajamas, hair flattened on one side, blinking at the light. He was 7 years old and had his mother's eyes wide and observant in a way that sometimes made Owen feel read rather than looked at. Benji took in the kitchen, took in his father, then turned his head toward the sofa in the living room. He looked back at Owen. Owen shrugged because he had no better answer. Benji disappeared upstairs. Owen assumed he had decided this was too strange and gone back to bed. Then the stairs creaked again, and Benji reappeared holding his quilted blanket, the one with the worn edges he had slept with since he was 3, the one that still, if you pressed your face into it, held the faintest trace of his mother's perfume from the last time she had washed it. Benji went into the living room without a word. Owen stood in the doorway and watched his son tuck the blanket carefully around the stranger's shoulders. The woman did not stir. Benji stood back, looked at her for a moment, then came back to the kitchen. She was cold, Benji said. Owen opened his mouth and found nothing there. He nodded. Benji nodded back and went upstairs, and Owen stood in the doorway for a long time after that, not moving. She woke just before 6. Owen heard the sofa creak and was in the doorway before she had fully sat up. She looked at the room slowly, cataloging without alarm. Then she looked at him. She was younger than he had assumed, mid-30s, dark hair coming loose from a ponytail, a smear of road salt on her left cheekbone. She looked at him steadily. "What time is it?" she asked. "Just past 6. She looked at the worn, quilted blanket across her lap. Something moved across her face. "Whose is this?" "My son's." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't have my phone. It was dead when I found you. It's charging on the kitchen counter. Thank you." She sat up straighter. "I'm Claire Ashton. Owen Calloway." She looked around the room, the low ceiling, the bookshelves, the framed photographs, the crack in the plaster above the front window and another above the kitchen door frame. The house was not falling apart. It was simply marked by time and a man too busy to attend to every small failure. "I'm not running from anything," she said, plainly, without emphasis. "I didn't ask," Owen Owen said. She looked at him, he looked at her. Outside, the snow was still coming down. The road crew did not clear Route 9 until the following afternoon, and the tow company could not retrieve Claire's car until the morning after that. The car had slid down an embankment, nothing dramatic, but enough to require equipment they would not bring out on icy roads. She would need to stay at least one more day. Owen told her this over breakfast and kept his face neutral. He made eggs. Benji sat at the table and ate slowly, which was how he always ate now, methodically, without the running commentary he had once kept up through every meal. He was quiet in a way that 7-year-olds were not supposed to be quiet. His right hand trembled occasionally when he lifted his fork, a small thing, barely visible, but Owen saw it every time and felt the same small contraction in his chest that he had been feeling for 8 months without knowing what to do about it. Claire sat across from Benji and drank her coffee without making the kinds of remarks adults made to children they did not know. She did not ask about school or comment on how big he must be getting. She simply sat and watched him the way she had watched the room when she first woke up, patient, taking things in without announcing it. Owen noticed her noticing. He felt his shoulders come up. He was rinsing plates at the sink when he heard her set her mug on the counter. He turned. She was looking at the small table by the front door where Owen dropped his keys, his mail, and a manila folder he had picked up from the pediatrician's office 8 months ago and never moved. The folder had Benji's name on the label tab. Beneath it, a printed reference line. Anxiety-related somatic symptoms, pending neurological evaluation. The follow-up had been recommended within 60 days. That had been 8 months ago. Owen knew what was in that folder. He had read it twice in the pediatrician's parking lot the day it was printed, standing beside his truck with the engine running, reading the words in the thin November light. The language was clinical and careful. Persistent somatic complaints in the context of complicated grief, possible anxiety disorder, recommend follow-up evaluation. He had put the papers back in the folder, put the folder on the passenger seat, brought it inside, set it on the table by the door, and had not touched it since. Moving it would have meant deciding what to do with it, and he had not been ready to make that decision. She was not reading it. She was simply aware of it. Owen dried his hands. "Roads partially open," he said. "Tow trucks booked until tomorrow." "I know. You told me. Just saying you're not trapped. I know that, too." She brought her mug to the sink. "I'll stay until the car's out." She said it without asking. He did not argue, but when she turned back toward the living room, he stood at the sink a moment longer, looking at the folder on the table, and felt something shift very slightly in the fixed architecture of how he had been managing things. The call came at 10:47 the following morning. Owen saw the school's number and felt the familiar low drop in his chest. Benji had become upset during reading group. He had gone quiet, then started shaking, then put his head on the desk. They had him in the counselor's office. Could Mr. Calloway come? Owen was already in his coat when he pushed through the back door. He put his key in the truck, turned it, and heard nothing. He tried again. Nothing. The cold had finally killed the battery. He had known it was coming for weeks and had not dealt with it. And now here it was, at the worst possible moment, which was how these things arranged themselves. He stood in the driveway with his hands at his sides and said something under his breath that he would not have said in front of Benji. Then he heard the side door open. Claire was already in her coat. Her keys were in her hand. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he walked to her car. They did not talk for the first several minutes. Owen kept his eyes on the road. The silence stretched until he became aware of the sound of his own breathing. And then, because the silence had reached a density that felt worse than whatever words might come out, he started talking. He told her about Sarah in a way he had never told anyone, not the clean version with the right pauses, but the actual one, with the details that did not reflect well on him. Sarah had been diagnosed 14 months before she died. The tumor was in a location that made surgery impossible. They had tried radiation twice, then a clinical trial that showed early promise before it did not. The bills had reached a number that appeared in his dreams by month 4. By month 9, Owen was taking every job available, doubling back on sleep, working weekends. Sarah had told him to go. She had told him she was fine, that the neighbor was stopping by, that he should stop hovering and go be useful. He had gone. The neighbor's car would not start that night. The hospital had called at 9:17. He was on a ladder with his hands in a junction box and did not hear it. He saw the missed call at 9:42, walked off the job site without a word, drove 40 minutes with his chest full of something that had no name yet, and by the time he reached the hospital, it had already been 30 minutes. A nurse named Patricia had been with Sarah at the end. Owen had shaken her hand in the hallway. He had gone in and sat beside the bed for 40 minutes without moving, holding a hand that was already cooling, and understood that he had not been there and that he would spend a great deal of his remaining life figuring out what to do with that. Benji had been 4 years old. He had not been at the hospital. Owen had dropped him at his mother's house for the afternoon. From the week of the funeral onward, the headaches started, then the tremor in his hands. Then, the fear of darkness and sirens and any sound that carried urgency in it, and Owen had taken the pediatrician's folder and put it on the table by the door and left it there, because doing something with it meant admitting how far behind he already was. He stopped talking. He realized he had his left hand wrapped around the door handle and let go of it. "You're carrying too much alone," Claire said. It was not what he had expected. He had expected comfort, something that smoothed the edges. What she said had no smoothing in it. It was simply what she saw, stated plainly, and it landed differently because of that. He did not reply, but when he set his hand back in his lap, it did not curl into a fist. The school counselor, a well-meaning man named Mr. Ferris, who wore patterned sweater vests and spoke in careful therapeutic cadences, had not been able to reach Benji. The boy was on a low bench in the hallway outside the counselor's office, knees pulled up, the quilted blanket in his lap. He must have had it in his backpack. He was looking at the floor with the particular focused stillness of a child who had learned that stillness was safer than motion. Claire crouched down beside the bench. She did not introduce herself or explain why she was there. She looked at the blanket. "That's a good one," she said. "The stitching on the lower corner, did someone repair it?" Benji looked at the blanket. "My mom did. It got ripped, and she fixed it. She did a good job. She was good at stuff like that," Benji said. And then, as if a door had been opened that he had forgotten he was keeping closed, he kept talking. He talked about the blanket, and then about his mother, and then about a dream from the previous week that had left him unsettled, and then about how sometimes at school when it got loud he felt like the loud was coming from inside rather than outside, and he did not know how to explain that to anyone because when he tried, people looked at him in a way that made him feel like he had said something wrong. "That's not wrong," Claire said. "That's a very accurate description of how anxiety feels. That is exactly what it is." Benji looked at her for a long moment, as if checking whether she meant it. "Does it go away?" "It gets quieter," she said. "With the right help, it gets a lot quieter. Some days it almost disappears completely." "How do you get the right help?" "You talk to someone who knows how to listen. And then you practice." She paused. "You're actually already doing it." "Right now." He considered this. Then he looked at the blanket corner his mother had repaired and ran his thumb along the stitching, and some of the tension in his small shoulders released in a way that was visible from across the hall. Owen stood on the other side of the counselor's door. He had one hand braced flat against the wall beside the narrow window in the upper panel of the door. He could see them through the glass, Claire on the floor, Benji with the blanket, both of them talking in the unhurried way of people who were not trying to get anywhere. He did not go in. He did not leave. He stayed exactly where he was, because moving in either direction felt like it would break something that was, for the first time in 8 months, beginning to come together. 20 minutes after Claire had crouched down beside that bench, Benji laughed. It was small and surprised the laugh of someone who had not expected to find something funny and was not entirely sure it was allowed. But it was real, and it was loud enough that Owen heard it through the closed door, and he pressed his hand flat against the wall and closed his eyes. On the drive home, Benji sat in the back seat watching the snow-covered fields go by. After a while, he said, without urgency, "Are you and my dad friends?" Claire glanced in the rearview mirror. "I'm someone your dad found on the side of the road." Benji considered this. "He does that," he said seriously. "He found our cat that way, and a dog once, but the dog's owner came and got it." A pause. "I think you're better than the cat." Owen, who had been staring out the passenger window with the studied blankness of a man trying not to react, made a sound in his throat that was mostly suppressed and partially not. Dale Pruitt's truck was in the driveway when they returned. Owen saw it and felt a specific kind of tired settle over him, not anger, just the fatigue that came from dealing with Dale, who was not a bad person but made everything slightly more complicated than it needed to be. Dale was on the porch, hands in his vest pockets, breath fogging in the cold. He was 47, heavy-set, with a contractor's hands and a planner's face, and had been circling Owen's accounts for 3 years in a way he probably thought was subtle. He and Sarah had been friends growing up, a fact Dale mentioned often enough that it had stopped feeling like information and started feeling like a credential he was presenting for inspection. He brightened the moment Claire stepped out of the car. "Claire Ashton," he said, coming down the porch steps with genuine recognition. "Burlington Gala. 2 years back you were doing work with the Cornerstone Foundation. I almost didn't recognize you out of context." He looked at Owen with the expansive enthusiasm of someone who believed he was delivering good news. "You know who you've got here? One of the top child psychologists in the state, out of Boston." Owen looked at Claire. She met his gaze with a steadiness that told him she had known this moment was coming and had not known how to prevent it without creating a different problem. "I didn't mention it," she said, "because I didn't want you to feel like a case study in your own kitchen. That's what you were doing, though." His voice came out harder than he intended. "No," she said. "I was having breakfast. You're a child psychologist and my son was sitting right there." "Yes, and you said nothing, Owen." Her voice stayed level. He said nothing. The answer was clear enough, and they both knew it. He would have thanked her, made sure she was warm, and driven her to a motel. He would have put careful distance between her credentials and his household and called it common sense. "I wasn't evaluating Benji," she said. "I was being a person in your kitchen. Those are different things." He asked her to leave anyway. He said it quietly, with Benji somewhere inside and Dale Pruitt on the porch making a poor attempt at neutrality. Claire did not argue. She went inside and gathered her coat, her phone, the charger from the kitchen outlet. She was at the door in under 4 minutes, moving with the efficiency of someone who had expected this and had already made peace with it. Benji was at the top of the stairs. "Where's Claire going?" he asked. His voice was small. Not alarmed, just asking, the way he asked things when he already suspected the answer might not be good and was checking whether it was worse than he thought. Owen stood in the entryway with the cold coming through the open door and looked at his son and found, for the second time in as many days, that he had nothing to say. Claire stopped with her hand on the doorframe. She did not turn around. She stood there for a moment, long enough that Owen could see Benji watching her from the stairs, waiting, and then she stepped outside, and the door closed behind her with the soft click of a latch settling into place. Her father's house sat on the western edge of Millhaven, set back from a gravel road behind birch trees tall enough to block the front windows from the late afternoon light. The structure was simple clapboard siding gone gray with years, a covered porch with a swing no one had used in a long time. Her father had retired from medicine 7 years ago and had lived here alone since her mother passed. He had died here alone 3 months ago while Claire was in Boston finishing a research paper she could no longer remember clearly. She had not come for the funeral. She had sent flowers, called the neighbor who found him, handled the arrangements by phone. She had given herself reasons for this. She was less certain of them now, standing on the porch with the key the attorney had mailed her. Inside, it smelled like him wood smoke, paper, and the faint chemical trace of the reference books lining every wall. His roll-up desk dominated the front room, its surface organized in the careful way of a man who knew where everything was. In a cleared space at the center of the desk, conspicuous among the orderly clutter, sat an envelope with her name on it in her father's handwriting. She took off her coat and sat in his chair and opened it. The letter ran 3 pages, written by hand. Her father had spent the last years of his practice working with a palliative care network patients in the late stages of illness who needed comfort managed more than a cure. He had never discussed these patients with her. Privacy, he had always said, and she had accepted it without pushing. One of those patients had been Sarah Calloway. He had known Sarah for the final 7 months of her life, had managed her pain protocol, had driven to the house twice when she was too weak to come in. He wrote that Sarah had talked about Owen without stop about his stubbornness and his quiet capability, about the way he expressed love through action rather than words, which was easy to miss if you were not paying close attention. She had talked about Benji. She had worried about Benji in the specific way of parents who knew they would not be present for the ordinary moments, which were, she had told him, the actual important ones. Her father wrote that he had carried this family in his thoughts for 3 years, that he had made one attempt an anonymous referral to a pediatric counseling group in Burlington that Owen had not followed through on, that he had grown worried in a way he could not act on directly, because acting on it would have required him to explain how he knew, and he was not willing to cross that line. So he had written to Claire instead. He had asked her if she was able to find a way to go by. She had missed the turnoff into Millhaven because she had never made this drive before. She had always told herself she would come when things were less busy. Things had never been less busy. She had made sure of it. She sat in the dark for a long time without turning on the lights. The room grew dim as the afternoon thinned. She sat with the letter in her lap and looked at his diplomas on the far wall and thought about all the years she had spent in Boston learning to understand other people's grief while keeping careful distance from her own. Her father had known this about her. He had known it and had said nothing, the way he had said nothing about his patients, and she understood now that his silence had not been withholding. It had been patience. He had been waiting for her to be ready to hear it, and he had run out of time to wait. She sat in his chair in the dark and understood, for the first time, that the letter was as much about her as it was about Owen and Benji. She knocked at 8 o'clock. Owen opened the door and looked at her without speaking. She held out the letter. He took it and read it standing in the open doorway, the cold moving between them. She watched his face and saw the exact moment he reached the part with Sarah's name. Something behind his eyes shifted, went very still, the way a room went still when someone suddenly understood something they had not known they were about to understand. His hand trembled once, briefly, and then stilled. He stepped back from the door. She came inside. They sat at the kitchen table without tea or anything else. Owen put the letter down flat on the wood and pressed his palm over it and looked at the grain for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The radiator clicked. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing against the windows in low, uneven gusts. Then he told her the thing he had never told anyone, not his brother, not his mother, not the grief counselor the hospital had recommended once, and he had seen exactly twice. He had been on a job site the night Sarah died. A commercial rewire in Burlington. A restaurant preparing to open. He had taken the extra work because the medical debt had reached a number that showed up in his sleep, and he had convinced himself that finishing this job quickly would mean things would get easier soon, and he had needed to believe that. Sarah had told him to go. She had said she was fine, that Ruth from down the street was coming by to sit with her, that he should stop hovering and go be useful somewhere. He had stood in the hallway of the hospital with his coat on and his keys in his hand and looked at her through the doorway, and she had made a small shooing motion with her hand, and he had gone. Ruth's car had not started. The hospital called his phone at 9:17. He was on a ladder 12 feet off the ground with both hands in a junction box, and the phone was in his jacket pocket on a nail on the wall below him, and he did not hear it. He saw the missed call at 9:42. He stepped off the ladder and walked off the job site without a word to anyone, left his tools where they were, drove 40 minutes on a highway that felt impossibly long, and arrived at the hospital 30 minutes after it was already over. A nurse named Patricia had been with Sarah at the end. Owen had shaken her hand in the hallway. He had gone into the room and sat beside the bed for a long time without moving, holding a hand that was already cooling, and had come to understand something that had no language in it, that he had not been there, and that he would spend the rest of his life deciding what to do with that fact. "That is why I cannot let anyone step in for Benji," he said. His voice was steady in the way that voices went steady when the alternative was not an option. "Because if someone else does it, a counselor, a professional, anyone, then I am admitting I could not handle it. And if I could not handle it, I failed him. And if I failed him, then I failed her too, on top of everything else. And I have enough of that already." He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Claire did not say that he was wrong. She did not say that he was not to blame, or that grief made people do things they would not otherwise do, or any of the other true things that were also not enough. She said, "Sarah knew what you were doing that night. She knew why you were there. It was not comfort. It was not reassurance. It was simply a true thing, stated plainly by someone who had read his wife's own words 3 hours earlier in a house that smelled like old books and wood smoke, and it reached somewhere in him that nothing else had reached in 3 years, because it had not tried to fix anything. It had simply told him what she knew. He did not cry, but he put his elbows on the table and covered his face with both hands, and stayed that way for a long time, and she did not say another word, and the wind pressed against the windows, and the house held them both. The next morning, Benji came down the stairs at 7:15 without being called. Owen heard the footsteps from the hallway and braced, waiting for the slow movement, the low complaint about his head. But the footsteps were quick, purposeful. Benji appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed, hair imperfectly but genuinely combed. He went to the cabinet, got a bowl, got the cereal, got the milk, and poured all three with the deliberate focus of someone who had recently decided to manage things for himself. Owen leaned against the hall wall and watched without speaking. He did not want to interrupt whatever was happening. He had learned, over the past 3 years, that certain mornings were fragile in ways that only became apparent after you had already broken them, and he was careful now in a way he had not always known how to be. Benji ate. The kitchen was quiet and ordinary. The light through the window was pale and flat, the kind that came before weather, and the radiator was ticking the way it always ticked in the first half hour after the heat kicked on. These were normal sounds. Owen had lived with them for 3 years, as background noise to a house that felt incomplete. This morning, for some reason he could not identify, they sounded simply like morning sounds. When Benji had settled at the table with his breakfast, he looked up. "Is Claire coming?" Owen looked at his son. The winter light was coming through the kitchen window, laying a stripe of pale sun across the table. Benji looked settled in a way that was hard to name, as if something braced inside him had, at least for this morning, unclenched. His hands around his bowl were easy, not gripping it, just resting. "I'll ask her," Owen said. He texted her at 7:45. He kept it brief because he did not know how to be otherwise. He told her Benji had asked. She replied that she would bring bread. She arrived at 8:30 with a loaf made from her father's kitchen notebook, honey oat, a recipe he had apparently made every Sunday for years that she had never tasted because she had never been there for those Sundays. The loaf was slightly uneven, and the crust was a shade darker than ideal, and it was the best bread Owen had eaten in longer than he could say. The three of them sat at the table, with the bread and butter and the pale winter sun through the window, and Benji asked Claire about the biggest snowstorm she had ever seen. She told him about a nor'easter that hit Boston when she was 12, snow piled to the tops of the fence posts, her father pulling her on a sled through the neighborhood, even though she was technically too old for it. She said her father had not cared about that part. He had said that sleds were for anyone who wanted to be pulled, regardless of age. Benji listened with his chin on his hand, asking his questions one at a time. The way he spent things, he was not sure he had enough of. Owen listened to both of them. He watched his son across the table, the way Benji's fork stayed still when he was listening, the way his hands rested easy, the way he laughed at something Claire said, without checking first to see if it was acceptable. The laugh was small and unguarded, and it filled the kitchen in a way that the kitchen had not been filled in a long time. Owen looked at Claire. She looked back at him. Neither of them looked away. She did not make an announcement about staying. She called her department coordinator in Boston and arranged 3 weeks of remote work, citing a family estate that required her presence, which was accurate. She moved into her father's house and began going through his things: files, books, the careful accumulations of a long and private life. Owen came by on the second day to fix a leaking pipe fitting under the kitchen sink. He did not charge her. She did not insult him by offering to pay. The days found their own rhythm. Owen would stop by her father's house in the mornings, or she would appear at his with coffee and whatever her father had left in the pantry, a jar of honey from the neighbor's bees, a seed catalog with margin notes. The bread again, which she was improving at with each attempt. Benji asked about her on the days she did not come, and Owen would text her, and she would appear. Benji had his first appointment with a pediatric counselor in Burlington 8 days after Owen submitted the referral. The counselor had a waiting room with good Legos and small sand trays on a windowsill. Benji found the trays calming. He told Owen on the drive home that the counselor was fine, which was the closest thing to an endorsement Benji gave anyone he had met fewer than 4 times. Owen reported this to Claire in her father's driveway that evening, standing in their coats with their breath clouding. She said that sounded about right for a first session. He appreciated that she left it there. A Thursday evening in the 3rd week, Owen drove to Burlington and sat in a gas station parking lot and submitted the online form for Benji's long-deferred neurology follow-up on his phone. He had opened and closed that form 3 times over 8 months. He submitted it this time without thinking about it too carefully, the way you did things when you had stopped waiting to feel ready. He mentioned it to Claire 2 days later, while they were standing over the hood of her father's car trying to interpret the check engine light. He said it the way he said things he did not want examined closely. She heard it the way it was meant. Dale Pruitt had submitted his bid for the Marston Property electrical contract with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 3 years cultivating the right relationships. The award notice came on a Thursday morning. Owen's name was on it. He had submitted his paperwork on the deadline date the same afternoon. Claire had sat across from him at the kitchen table with her laptop open and asked, without preamble, what his outstanding deadlines were. He had told her. She had given him the look she gave when something was overdue and obvious. He had found the forms and filed them that afternoon. Dale called to congratulate him in a voice that managed to sound both gracious and genuinely puzzled. Owen thanked him and let it be what it was. The morning she left, Benji had been told the night before. He had received the information with the careful composure of a child who had learned that composure was something you practiced until it became something you felt. At breakfast he was quieter than usual, and twice Owen watched him look at the door. Claire arrived at 9 with her bags already packed. She traveled light, which Owen had noted and which seemed consistent with everything he had come to understand about her. She set the bags by the door and crouched down to Benji's level. Benji held out the quilted blanket. She looked at it. She looked at him. "That's yours," she said. "I know," he said. "I want you to have it, so you're not cold." She accepted it without further argument, which was the right thing to do, and she folded it carefully over her arm. Owen watched this happen and felt the kitchen hold something for a moment, some quality of completeness that he did not have a word for and did not try to name. He walked her to the car. They stood on the gravel drive in the cold. The sky was the flat white of a day that might snow again by afternoon. Her car was running, heat building up inside. She had her keys in her hand. "Next time, don't stand in the road during a blizzard," he said. She laughed, a real one, the kind he had heard more of over the past 3 weeks. "Next time, don't wait so long to brake." He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a whole conversation in that look, and neither of them put words to it, because words would have made it smaller than it was. She got in the car. She drove through Millhaven and out toward the state highway. Just before the on-ramp, she passed the stretch of Route 9, where it had happened, the long, flat curve with the birch trees on the right and the open field dropping away on the left, the guardrail, missing a reflector. She had noticed that detail on the night Owen found her, in the last moment before the car stopped moving. She slowed down without deciding to. There was nothing to see. The ditch was empty, the field undisturbed, the road clear. But she slowed anyway, and looked at the place where one person had stopped for another person, and neither of them had understood yet what that stop would cost them or give them. Then she checked her mirrors. In the rearview glass, the road behind her was empty and straight, and in the far distance she could just make out the lights of Millhaven, the water tower, the church steeple on Elm Street, and faint and warm against the white of the morning, the windows of Delwood Lane. She drove. The highway opened ahead of her, wide and clear. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not in a rush at all.